So we're very happy today to have with us Amit Garg, and thank you very much for joining us
Thank
today.
you for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We're very happy to be with you because you have a really fascinating career that we've seen and we know a little bit about. You started your career at Google, and then you joined a venture capital firm. Then you went on and you actually did your own startup. And now you're back in the VC world from the corporate side. And I just what I want to just clarify before we start with the questions is, so Amit is speaking personally today from his personal experience. He's not speaking as a representative of the corporate VC that he's at. So we wanted to just clarify that. And Amit, if I can just start with, what is the biggest difference that you see, say, between a classical, say, a business angel or classical VC in comparison to a corporate venture capitalist?
So let me actually mention this as a clarification. An angel investor, the definition is he or she is investing their own capital,
Right.
and then a VC is investing other people's capital. And there's a little bit of shades of gray in between this. But a corporate VC is just a different type of VC in that I'm investing a corporate's capital.
Right.
And my corporate becomes my LP. Typically, corporate VCs will have a single LP. And it can be two big differences. It can be out of a balance sheet, meaning if the corporate is doing really well, you have more money to invest. If the corporate is maybe not doing as well, you have less money to invest. Or it could be a dedicated fund, meaning the corporate has set up an independent fund, and no matter what happens to the corporate, they're saying, okay, look, you are investing out of this separate fund.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you for clarifying that, because we get questions about that ourselves. Particularly people that are kind of new to the startup world aren't familiar with those differences. Okay, great. And so obviously, traditional VCs, they're looking for high returns on their investments. What type of KPIs do you normally see that they're focused on? Key performance indicators or key metrics?
Right. So corporate VCs come in many different flavors, and there are corporate VCs that are very much aligned strategically, meaning they're looking at how can they invest in companies that will benefit the mothership as much as possible, and they're not interested as much or at all in the financial returns. So in those cases, the corporate VC is looking for collaborations or synergies and trying to see, look, how is this technology going to help us? Maybe we can license it, maybe we can co-sell it, maybe we can maybe the startup is helping us develop the market. There's many different ways of collaborating. On the other extreme of a corporate VC, there are a few entities that are behaving almost like a traditional VC in that they're investing purely for a financial return.
Right.
And in that case, they're looking for financial ROI, which is I put in $1 in and I get $10 back. I made 10 times the amount of money. Most corporate VCs fall somewhere between that spectrum, and it's not necessarily even a binary decision. You could have a corporate VC that's tracking financial metrics, and most of them do, but that may not make their final decision on an investment based on that. They might make it based on the number of collaborations that they're driving.
Sure. And when you so if you think about corporate VCs, let's say in Silicon Valley broadly, so you see that whole range as well, or do you see that corporate VCs in Silicon Valley are typically more focused on the strategic investment, or are they more towards the higher ROI in the shorter term?
No, I see the whole range.
Okay.
And in fact, let me also present this from the entrepreneur's perspective. The reason you as an entrepreneur would go talk to a corporate is because of what that corporate can help you and enable you and empower you. If I'm talking to a corporate, I may be able to leverage their distribution. I may be able to leverage their R&D. I may be able to even just leverage their brand. And otherwise, it's just money, and it's money as good as any other money.
Right.
So the differentiation that a corporate provides is actually the resources of the corporate.
Sure.
And for a corporate VC to be tied in can be a big win-win. It's a win for the corporate in the sense that they can promote more open innovation, And it's a win for the entrepreneur because they can accelerate the development of their technology and their company.
Sure. And so, because it's interesting, you've been on both sides. You've been a startup founder and you've been on the VC side and worked for a large company as well. If you're thinking about, say, from a startup founder's perspective, what are the things, how would you suggest that they do their screening of a corporate VC or of a corporation that they might want to form a partnership with?
So an entrepreneur will understand his or her business better than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
And they will have I would presume, a good idea of this is how this particular corporate might be able to help me. I don't know quite exactly because I don't know fully the extent of the resources of that corporate, but I have an inkling. If I'm looking for, let's say, one of my big pain points is distribution, and I know that this particular corporate can be able to help me a lot in the distribution, then it could be a good target.
Yeah.
So that's homework on your side. But then to your point, the questions to ask are, understand how will the corporate work with you? Are they investing? Do they have a particular amount that they would invest?
Yeah.
Do they have a requirement around ownership? Do they have a requirement around board seats? Do they have any restrictions in who you can also work with? Does it also, even if they don't, how does it potentially impact your work? Because if you get a corporate investment from an entity and then its competitors will look at that and say, wait a second, you're invested by them, we are now a little hesitant to working with you. So it can be a little complicated to think through this. However, for a good corporate VC will illuminate all of that to the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And a good corporate, and different corporates will use different strategies here, and I'm not putting a value judgment necessarily on which one is the best possible strategy. But for an entrepreneur, the best thing you can do is ask these questions, the ones that I just mentioned,
yeah,
and try to understand how is the corporate VC set up, how are they being incentivized, and how are they empowered to work with you.
Great, great. And then if we think, so let's say a startup team has identified a couple of companies they'd like to approach that seem strategically to make a lot of sense for them. Mm-hmm. How do you recommend that those startup teams go ahead and approach those companies, those corporate ventures, corporate VCs?
Well, if you already have identified the 2 or 3, presumably those 2 or 3 corporates have a venture arm.
Yeah.
That's oftentimes the best way to work with a corporate if you're looking for an investment. It's not the only way though. Some corporates don't have a venture arm. And in that case, they might have a corporate development arm. And the distinction here is a venture arm is really set up more independently, more autonomously to make investments. A corporate development arm, by definition, is much more tied to the corporate interest. It's actually very much still part of the corporate. If they don't have a corporate development arm, or maybe you didn't connect with them, sometimes a business unit within a corporate might also be able to do investments. You have to be aware, though, that in some corporates, how the decision making for an investment is made. Typically, a venture group is given a lot more autonomy. They sometimes can make their own decisions, or if they are not making their own decisions, their approval process internally might be more streamlined. A corporate development is very much tied to the corporate, so their decision making is intrinsically linked to the corporate. And then a business unit will obviously look at the decision making from the business unit's perspective.
Sure.
So in terms of autonomy, I would put them in a scale where the venture unit will be the most autonomous and the business unit will be the least autonomous. Once again, I'm not putting a judgment value on this because if your interests are to work inherently with one particular business unit, and let's say you're doing an R&D integration and you really want this business unit to help you, maybe the right conversation is to go straight to the business unit. But I would argue that in general, if a corporate has a venture arm, that is the best point of entry for you. You should figure out where the corporate venture arm is located. You should figure out a way to approach them. You should figure out whether they would be open to talking to you because you are at the right stage or at the right geography for you to do that. And then you should just follow up there.
Okay, great. And when you think about, say, a corporate VC and compare that to a traditional VC, Are there differences in the documents that they use? And if so, can you talk about those?
The vast majority of documents are the same. If you think about a corporate VC, it's a VC. It's, they're looking at term sheets and cap tables and your presentation, your slides, your business model, all of those things. They're exactly the same. Now, the difference comes in that as a corporate VC, you have this big engine behind you, this corporation. And you want to make sure that the engine and the startup, they have a relationship that's a win-win. You don't want either side to be imbalanced. So oftentimes a corporate, once they're making the investment, will have an instrument that's called a side letter, where they detail, look, this is how we want to make sure, this is not just the terms of the investment, but this is how kind of we want to make sure that we'll be able to work effectively with you. Many side letters will have terms like, who can you get acquired by? Who can you be invested by? Who can you do business with? If you get an offer of an acquisition, how do you notify us? And most of them are, I would argue, have very standard terminology around these. But that's what when you're getting an investment from a corporate, you should scrutinize. You should make sure that if there is any point there that doesn't make sense to you, that you clarify with the corporate.
So that's really interesting, because then I can imagine, to your point, so this side letter is really critical, because if there could be terms in there where if the corporation, the venture fund, and the startup team, if they're not in an alignment, then it could lead to some challenges.
That's right, and that's a negotiation. That's just like negotiating a term sheet. That's a negotiation, a conversation first, and a good corporate VC will be transparent and open, and will explain if there need be, and you should have your own counsel, meaning your own lawyers, as an entrepreneur. But I would argue it's not that different from a conversation around a term sheet. Maybe the things that you're talking about are slightly different, but it's the same process.
Okay, all right, great. And then when you think about, let's say corporate venture funds that are looking more on the ROI side, maybe they're not looking at as much for a long-term strategic investment. And if that type of organization is looking at a startup, what type of traction are they typically looking for in that startup early on?
Sure. Well, I will tell you how I look. I do early stage investing, which in my world means seed, Series A, and Series B. And I know it's very confusing sometimes to define what's a seed, what's a Series A, what's a Series B. Some people tell me, oh, I just did a $20 million Series A. And then somebody says, well, that's not a Series A then. And somebody tells me they did a $500,000 Series B. I haven't heard of that one, but it could happen, I guess. I think that the key is how you use those funds. It's not how much you raise. If you're using those funds to prove your prototype, you're a seed. If you're using your funds to prove your product, then you're an A. If you're using those funds to prove your business model, you are a Series B. And I, as well as I think my larger industry, will look at a startup based on that. If you are claiming to be seed stage, we're not expecting necessarily that you will have a huge amount of traction. We understand that what we're looking for is early proof points. Maybe you have been able to show demand. Maybe you have been able to show that customers will buy it, or that you're able to do pilots with, let's say you're working with other companies. If you're doing a Series A, and let's say it's a consumer model, you want to start seeing the uptick of an exponential growth curve. You're saying, look, I'm actually being able to lower the cost of acquisition of my customers, and I'm being able to scale and get more and more of them. And in a Series B, I'm already expecting that story to have been played out, and I'm looking at, I'm able to monetize much more effectively. My LTV, my lifetime value is increasing. So it's a different angle at which I will analyze a different stage of the company.
Because at that point, at that stage, then you're looking to see proof of the business model itself.
Correct. Now, these are guidelines. These are not set in stone. Venture capital and entrepreneurship are both sciences and arts. I have an article on my LinkedIn for those who want to read more. But there is an art and science to raising venture capital. There is an art and science to creating a startup. You could have a Series B company that may be unproven in terms of business model, and it will generate more questions. But if you're able to answer those questions, it does not preclude necessarily an investment. Sure. It just makes it perhaps harder.
Sure.
But it doesn't preclude it. But typically, I would say, yes, you should have at least enough indication that your business model is scaling at a Series B.
Okay, great. And then if we talk about a range of investment sizes, what do you typically see, broadly speaking, for a corporate VC, both the range and then kind of what their expectations might be in terms of what they would expect back for their investment?
There's a whole big range
Sure.
on this. It's very hard. Just like the traditional VCs, financially oriented VCs come in many size, shapes, and forms.
Yeah.
Corporate VCs are they're siblings. They will come in many shapes,
Yeah.
sizes, and forms also. There are corporate VC funds that are $1 billion plus. I work for a fund that's $1 billion plus, $1 billion plus.
Yeah.
And there are corporate VC funds that are much smaller, could be within the tens of millions of dollars. Some of them will write really big checks, $100 million, $200 million. There are examples of that. And some of them will explicitly have a guideline that, look, we're only going to write check sizes up to 1 million or 2 million, given the goals that they have. So these are questions you should ask your potential investor, just like you would ask any other investor. In general, what I would say is, the more important question is understand what's the motivation of the corporate, rather than necessarily even the check size or the size of the fund. If the motivation of the investor is, I'm going to be in this startup, I'm going to invest, I'm willing to do follow-on rounds, I'm willing to put my resources beyond the money to help you continue growing. I'm in this to basically make sure that it's a win-win. And maybe I will put a small amount of capital, or maybe I'll put a large amount of capital. But the more interesting is the second part, which is what I'm going to do for you. I think that's a much more important question to understand.
Okay, that's a really powerful word too. Is just motivation, just understanding that from both sides. So can you tell me, what does that normally look like in conversations early on between, say, a startup founding team and a corporate fund, a VC fund? Is this just both sides laying it out on the table to get to the motivation, or what types of conversations can lead to kind of unveiling, to have as much transparency there as possible?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so for an entrepreneur, let's say you are an entrepreneur coming to me, the very first thing I would do is spend a few minutes sharing more on what we do and what motivations we have, what angles we have. A good corporate VC will share that upfront, and if for whatever reason they haven't, it's a very easy question to ask. It's, tell me the check sizes you write, tell me what stage are you playing, tell me what are your requirements for on board seat or ownership, tell me some of the previous investments you have made and what have they led to. Tell me if I can still continue working with other corporates, and if I get an acquisition offer from one of them, what happens? Those are all very fair questions. And a good corporate VC will share that upfront. It's sometimes for whatever reason somebody might not mention something. In that case, I think it's a very fair question for the entrepreneur to ask. Okay,
great. And do you normally invest by yourself as a corporation, or do you co-invest with regularity?
We prefer the fund that I work for prefers co-investing, and I would say that that's actually the norm. Most corporate VCs are looking to co-invest, and that's good for both sides. For a corporate VC to be able to co-invest with a financially oriented VC, it's a validation on both the commercial aspects and the strategic aspects. So it's a great signal to the market that, look, this company here is producing a technology that is very interesting, and the technology also has a commercial viability. Otherwise, you wouldn't have somebody who's investing purely based on financial motivations. It's also good for the entrepreneur. because then I think you can really leverage the strengths of both. A financially oriented VC will be able to write you a check and maybe more checks down the road. But what you're really telling to the world is, look, I can take this company and I can make it into a huge, huge success.
Yeah.
A corporate VC, on the other hand, the signal I'm sending is, look, what I'm doing is inherently interesting, at least to one corporate. And that corporate may be able to license this technology, may be able to take it further, may be able to repurpose it in some ways, may be able to help me in a big way. Imagine if you are an entrepreneur and you're talking to some financial VCs, they will give you the money, but you may not be able to get into the hands of 10,000 stores, for instance. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking to the corporate, that corporate may actually help you get there.
So that, and interestingly, that is a great segue to our next question, which is kind of what, and you've spoken about this somewhat already, Amit, in terms of what can startups expect from the corporate VC fund they're working with. You've talked about know-how. You've talked about in introductions. Can you talk about what to expect from the corporate side in a little more detail?
Sure. Yeah. So obviously know-how.
Yeah.
A corporate will often understand a particular market or a particular technology really in depth. If they're working in it, they will have perspectives and views that they will be able to help you with.
Yeah.
And when I am on the board of a company, I am really, really active in helping them continue succeeding. I will be constantly sharing, look, this is what I'm seeing, these are the technologies I've seen. I have behind me an engine that's really helping me. Yeah. So that's one big aspect. The other one is simply resources. If I'm a startup and I'm trying to go from 1 to 100, that 99, maybe because of manufacturing, maybe because of R&D, maybe because of distribution, maybe because of sales, maybe things that the corporate investor can really help you with. I've had many companies, startups who we work with tell me that even the brand sometimes really helps. If they are talking to a potential customer and say, look, so-and-so is behind us, the brand itself already helps move the needle. Yeah. Because, there are a few brands out. The corporate brands are far more known than the investor brands. There's a few investor brands that are well known, but even they overall don't compare to the corporate brands. Yeah. And the last thing I would say is for sure on hiring and networking. That's I would argue any investor can really help you, but it is a big validation. I invested recently in a self-driving car company, and for me to be in this company, it's called Nutonomy. Now they can claim publicly, look, Samsung is behind us, and that can help attract more talent around the company.
Totally makes sense. And it was interesting, as you were saying that as well, it reminded me before we started videoing, you were talking about, you also look for ways to leapfrog in markets, to not necessarily, if you're working with a startup, where how they can go from step A to B, but how can they really take giant leaps? Can you talk about maybe things that you've seen before, either things you've done yourself and been able to leapfrog the competition or build out a unique position in a market before, or companies that you've invested into, where this is kind of an example of the power of being able to leapfrog this way?
So leapfrog can come in many different ways, right? Leapfrog could be from a technology perspective, and the first example that comes to my mind is I look at the usage of cell phones in many parts of the world. Many countries had very poor or non-existent landline systems, and they were literally able to go from that environment to going straight into cell phones. Yeah. And the reason they were able to do that is because the new companies that came up, they didn't go through the steps in between. They promoted the latest technologies already. So that's from a technological leapfrog. Yeah. Now, a corporate investor can really help you with the technological leapfrog, because if you are trying to validate a particular technology, the corporate could actually help you, as we said, about distribution, R&D, manufacturing. And if you are a startup that's in an environment here, by having the corporate, it's literally like putting a big engine behind you, and you can scale much faster. But I would argue it's not just technology. Yeah. It could also be scaling in terms of business model. Yeah. If I am selling, let's say, to other companies, maybe drafting contracts and executing on those contracts, maybe me, myself, with my sales force, I'm getting 5 or 6 contracts a month. But if I provide the technology also in some ways with the corporate, maybe the corporate can push this technology using their own sales force. And now maybe there's a bundled package. And now, instead of 5 or 6, you're getting 500, 600. So you can also leapfrog from that perspective.
That's great. Yeah, that's super. Last 2 questions we have today. So if you think about the current investment climate, how is that impacting investment opportunities in valuations? How would you characterize what you're seeing currently?
Well, so today is March of 2016, so put it in context for those of you watching this later. Right now, at least what we're seeing is there are, and this is not a novel argument, this is something that many people have written and spoken at extensively, but many private companies have very large valuations, and they are not going public, and they are seeing the prospects of not being able to raise more funds, or that their valuations will be corrected. So at the later stage, companies that so-called unicorns that have $1 billion plus in valuations, quite a few of them have seen a correction just in the last month. Yeah. They have seen flat rounds or down rounds, which means that their valuation they bought more capital in, and their valuation was flat, or it even went down. Yeah. And I think that correction is invariably going to affect the entire ecosystem. We see some effects of that in the early stage also. I presume most people watching are in early stage startups, and good companies are going to be funded no matter what. Yeah. And in fact, corrections are good because it will take away the noise of many companies and make sure that the best ones get highlighted. That said, the flip side is, once you have a market that's getting corrected, there's a tendency for people to swing the pendulum a little bit the other way, or even too much the other way. So I do expect, and there's much research and much surveys about this, but I do expect it to be harder to raise funding overall this year than previous year. Yeah. I do expect it to last for some time. It's not going to be tomorrow it's gone. I think it's going to be a gradual process, and I don't expect it to stop good companies from getting funded, but I do hope actually that it will reduce the noise. We see a lot of companies out there with unrealistic expectations in terms of valuations and value. Once those get corrected, the entrepreneurs really building value will be able to also get good valuations.
It's a great point. You know, having worked and lived here through the first bubble, or let's say the bubble of 2000, to your point, there was a massive amount of noise in that system. Yep. So that's a great point. Yep. And then, so the last question really today is just an open one, really. Is there anything that we haven't covered today, or anything of particular that you're particularly passionate about that you would love to give as a last piece of advice?
Well, I think I'm going to build on what you just said. Yeah. I think building cutting edge innovation is amazing because yes, there's a time and place to take existing business models and to take existing products and adapt them to a local reality. Absolutely, and that's very necessary. But what gets me most excited as an actor in this space is how can we push the boundaries of what we are as a human species, really? How can we produce the next set of augmented reality or virtual reality? How can we do self-driving cars? How can we do smart homes? How can we do the next generation of processing payment systems? I think if And I see innovation coming from everywhere in the world. So how can we push the boundaries beyond? And that's what I would encourage all of us to continue thinking of and continue doing.
That's the best place we could have ended. That's a great piece of advice. If someone had told me 10 years ago that that you would be investing into self-driving cars this quickly, I wouldn't have believed it would be happening that fast.
I can't wait for the day.
I
can't wait for the day. Yeah.
That's really going to be exciting to see. Thank you so much for all your time today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah.